Thanks for the introduction. My name is Ruth Kevlin. I'm a clinical psychologist and a psychotherapist working in disability here in Ireland. And I haven't actually contributed to one of these events before, so I'm very honored to be here. My understanding is that I'm going to present for a portion of the time, and then for the rest of the time, we're going to have a discussion. As you can see from the title of my presentation, the focus will be on the importance of the parent-child relationship, often otherwise known as the attachment relationship. And what we're going to cover today is really to explore the importance of that parent-child attachment relationship, and particularly to think about the parent's contribution to that relationship, with the view really to considering how we can use the knowledge that we currently have these days to further support children with disability and their families. And I'll be using a case study to hopefully illustrate the material. The case study will outline some therapeutic work that I completed with a mom whose name is Lillian, to address some of the difficulties that she was experiencing in her relationship with her son, David, that were impacting on David's progress. Just to be really clear that I have mom's permission to do this, and I'm also really lucky to have a mom's own words to describe her experience of the work that we did, because at her request, we recorded the sessions that we shared together, and then she very kindly gave me permission to use her words in fora like these with other parents to encourage and to explain the work that we've done and the benefits that she got from it. My intention is that you'll find a hopeful message in this presentation. I know myself through my therapeutic work that sometimes there's maybe a little taboo about talking about the parent-child relationship, for fear somehow that there is blame, or a parent may feel blamed for some of the difficulties that the child is experiencing. And that couldn't be further from my intention. What I really want to do is to illustrate how, despite many of the, unlike many of the things many of the things in disability that we cannot change, this is actually something that we can change if we understand it. And if it needs to be changed, it doesn't always need to be changed. We don't always need to address these issues. But where there are difficulties in the parent-child relationship, it is really important to know that if we explore it and we understand it better, then it really can help both mother and child and the family in general. So I'm hoping that's the message that you'll leave with today. So why focus on attachment? Well, we now have decades of research into childhood development that tell us that in order to understand a child, we really must understand the parent and the child relationship, that we can't really understand a child in isolation. Such is the importance of that relationship with the parent, particularly in the early stages of development. And there's, again, quite a body of evidence to illustrate that during infancy, a child's developmental progress is dependent in part, not in full, in part, on the quality of the interaction between the mother and the infant. Obviously, particularly in disability, other factors that are crucially important are genetics and intellectual impairment and sensory issues and temperament and physical constraints and disabilities. All of those factors are critically important, but so too is the quality of the attachment relationship between the child and the mother, and then, subsequently with the father, particularly in the early weeks, days, weeks and months, and early years, it tends to be the mother. What we also know is that one of the most important determinants of the quality of this parent-child relationship is the parents' own attachment relationship with their parents, their own experience of being parented, which of course makes sense, because, where else do we learn this implicit or instinctive information about how to parent except through our experiences of being parented by our parents? This instinctive implicit information is passed on transgenerationally. And so, that's a crucially important part of the equation. And here's just a very simple graphic to illustrate my point, that the parent comes to the infant-child relationship with a whole set of implicit unconscious information about what it means to be a parent, what's expected of them as a parent, and how to parent. So I guess in reflecting on the topic, I feel that, in my own opinion, quite often in the disability services, we see the child in isolation from the parent, and we focus on key areas: the child's cognitive development, their speech and language development, sensory issues, behavioral needs. We focus on all of those, and they are imperative to focus on. But we often also, we often consider those without also recognizing that the child will benefit and better achieve its potential in all of those areas if they have the benefit of a safe and secure attachment relationship. So it's not either or, it really needs to be both, and we need to consider all of those in the context of the attachment relationship. And Crittenden, who is a leading figure in the whole area of the parent-child relationship, has a very nice phrase, and she says that for the infant, there is more information on a mother's face about the world than in any other place. So it's through the relationship that the child develops thought, develops language, develops a knowledge of emotions, develops social engagement. And with a few notable exceptions, actually, I mean, quite often, again, when we do parenting work in the area of disability, we often don't consider that piece of the graphic I showed you, the parent's own experience of being parented, and how this in turn affects their capacity to parent their child. And in fact, when you sit back and think about it, perhaps, you could argue that we should prioritize that even more in disability, because of the number and the range of challenges that parents face parenting a disabled child, that may disrupt the attachment relationship. So for example, I guess depending on the type of disability, the nature of the disability, I mean, the child may, give atypical or subtle cues to the mother that she may struggle to understand, which may interrupt the flow and the reciprocity in the relationship from the very beginning. The child, if they have an intellectual disability, will have an impaired understanding, perhaps of what is required, of what's been communicated. Some children are hyper responsive, and that can be quite challenging for the parents to manage. And some children are under responsive. And we know that unless mom gets a smile, for example, within, maybe approximately 2 months, that can actually be very disruptive to the development of the attachment feelings. It's quite difficult. It's a relationship, and mom needs and should expect, to have a response to her response to the child. So that can create difficulties. And the child may be less able then to communicate their needs because of their disability. And then the parent may well have gone through very significant trauma. For example, many of the parents we work with, moms in particular, but also dads, have experienced significant perinatal trauma, either at birth or subsequently. They're having to come to terms with, often multiple diagnoses that can lead to experiences of grief and anxiety and potentially depression, if not managed and supported. They often do report a lack of support, both from family, immediate family, extended family, and from services, and can find themselves feeling quite isolated and different. And very often the parent, in addition to being a parent, is expected to be a teacher and a therapist. And at times this can get in the way of the attachment relationship, because the focus and all the exercises that have been given by all of the different disciplines can actually take from the experience of just being with your child, and not seeing interactions with your child either as a teaching opportunity or, implementing one of the plans that they have. And parents often experience, they talk about experiencing either a fear of separating from their child as they grow older, which can feel quite controlling to the child because of a very understandable fear that they almost lost their child. So of course they're going to be protective and sometimes overly protective. And other parents talk about the fear of the future and the notion that their child will be forever dependent on them, and how difficult that is, depending on their own experiences of separation and dependency and attachment in general with their own parents. They will bring these experiences with them, and then they have to face these additional challenges on top of that. So when you put it all together, it is quite a challenge for a parent and child when the child has a disability. And what we want to think about is what the parent brings in the first instance that then is exacerbated by some of these difficulties. We know from attachment theory now that wherever there is a threat to one's child or to oneself, that the parent will automatically and unconsciously default to whatever strategies they learned, they used to cope with threat in their own childhood and since. And when I say threat, I don't just mean threat to life, which a lot of our parents have experienced, but also neglect, rejection, abandonment, which to us humans feels extremely threatening. It feels as if it is an actual danger. If the parent has had a good enough experience of being parented, and if they had a good, balanced attachment strategy to their own parent, then they will adapt. They will adapt to the challenges of having a child with a disability and the changes that they may need to make to their lives as a result. They will adapt well. And many parents do. If they were not lucky enough to have that experience, then the parent may struggle to adapt. And I guess those are the parents that would come to the door of the psychology service here, where I work. So the question is then, how has their experience of being parented, how is that going to impact on their capacity to parent their child, given the additional challenges and threats that they may feel in relation to all of those factors that I've discussed? So let's maybe have a look at the case study in the hope that it may bring to life some of these ideas. So this is Lillian, who is a mom, and David, who is her little boy. David's one of two boys. He has a younger brother called Mark. He was 11 years old when he came to see me in psychology, and he was presenting with autism and sensory difficulties and sleep difficulties. And he attended the sleep clinic, or not, he attended the feeding clinic here in the CRC, where he was diagnosed with avoidant resistant food intake disorder, which had very significant impact on his physical health. He was very seriously constipated and experienced leakages from time to time, which were really debilitating in terms of his capacity to do normal activities that little 11-year-old boys would do. He couldn't go swimming, he couldn't go on sleepovers. He was constantly fearful that he would leak feces during his school day and that he would smell. And so it really was restricting and debilitating for him. So I worked with Mom and Peter and David, and the three of us worked together over a number of months. And David made significant progress and was not experiencing the level of constipation by the end of the work, and he was eating a wider range of food. Not a huge number, but that would be normal for children. You wouldn't expect them to suddenly start eating a wide range of foods. He was certainly improving to such an extent that his consultant had discharged him and was very pleased with his progress. However, it became very clear at the end of that work that Mom was unable to build on this progress. And in working together and exploring this, she was able to identify a problem in her attachment relationship with David. She had identified that, but she didn't know what to do. And so we were able to, plan a way forward in order for her to get some help with this. So as we began to do that work, she began to explain the origins of some of the difficulties with David. And she said things like having David was been like hit by a bus. He was a nightmare. She and her husband seriously felt that they couldn't cope with him. and that they would need to give him up for adoption. They didn't obviously put that in train, but that certainly was in the back of her mind for quite a period of his early life. It was in the arena of food that things really began to get difficult, and that became, as she called it, the battleground in their relationship. And she said to me, the trust is gone. He does not trust me to feed him. And she said, I don't know how to respond. So I've trained in the adult attachment interview and have done used that to do therapeutic work with parents before. So I felt actually that Lillian will be a prime candidate for support using the adult attachment interview, which I won't explain here, but we can talk about it later if you like. But the relief was palpable, and it really is quite moving when parents feel understood and supported. And what she said to me was, through tears, I've been waiting for 11 years for someone to ask me how I am. So she was very much a willing participant in this work and was very curious, although very anxious and fearful of what she might actually unearth. And the adult attachment interview is, it probes into the parents' own attachment experiences through their childhood and adolescence and then into their adulthood. So she was aware that we were going to be sort of going back in order to come forward and to identify what might she have been bringing with her into her parenting relationship with David that was causing difficulties. So it became very evident that Lillian had a very difficult attachment relationship herself as a child and adolescent. She was one of 3 children, but she was a twin. She had a twin brother, which became an interesting piece of this puzzle as well, in the sense that she felt that she was half a person, being one of a twin pair. But she had, her mom was quite psychiatrically ill and spent a number of periods in psychiatric hospital. But during her more difficult times, she would severely beat Lillian with implements with her hands, but it was really quite significant beatings at times. And she would emotionally and verbally abuse Lillian. She would tell her she was fat or ugly. She would threaten to leave her. She said she'd had enough, and at any stage she might walk out the door, which absolutely terrified Lillian, obviously, as a child. When she was 15, she discovered her brother who had hung himself, who had committed suicide. And soon after she decided she wanted to get away from the house, she went to boarding school at a very young age. And when it was legally possible, she changed her name by default. So she really did want to distance herself from the experiences she's had. She had a lot of unresolved loss in relation to the brother and trauma in relation to the beatings and the emotional abuse and the neglect. And as a result of all of that, she developed a strategy of coping, an attachment strategy, which was characterized by really self-reliance. She had given up on seeking comfort and care from anyone. And she had really pulled right back, become a very independent, self-reliant woman, and was denying her own emotions and was denying her own perspective. In order to survive, she had to distort, I guess, reality, and she had taken a lot of the responsibility for what had happened onto herself. So really quite a significant history. I was very surprised. And again, it just reminds me that when a parent comes into the service, you really have no idea what is in their past and what underlies their difficulties and their experiences. And it really was important to unearth and explore some of this with her. Because the question that we were ultimately interested in asking was, okay, so this is what happened to you. What meaning have you given to this, and how have you adapted to what's happened to you? And then specifically, how is this impacting on your parenting of David? How is it impacting on your attachment relationship with him? And there were many different areas that we could have looked at, but there were 3 areas in particular that were particularly relevant. The first was her strategy of rejecting her own emotional needs. The second was the issue of her unresolved loss and trauma, people experience challenging and dangerous situations in their lives, but they don't necessarily experience trauma as a result. It's not the event itself, it's the meaning that you attribute to the event. And in Lillian's case, she was experiencing trauma, and there was unresolved loss, which was impacting on her relationship with David. And thirdly, it was her perception that she herself was bad, that she was the source of badness, that she was the source of the difficulty in her relationship, that she was to blame for the difficulties that had occurred and had been inflicted on her. So I guess we took these three themes and we worked through them over the course of several months. I think we worked together for maybe four and a half, maybe 5 months of weekly sessions. Mostly, there were a few when she couldn't attend, but mostly weekly sessions, exploring these and linking her experiences to her parenting of David. And this is some of the things that we discovered. We discovered that the rejection of her own emotional needs and her pattern of blocking her dependency on other people meant that she didn't know what to do then with her own children's emotional needs and their dependency needs. And particularly then, because David brought his own additional needs and his own big emotions that she did not know how to cope with at all. Because it brought her back to her own experiences as a child. And in fact, she experienced David's needs for comfort and reassurance as extremely clingy, and she rejected them because that is how her mother had responded to her need for comfort. And so essentially, we talked through how she had responded when David did have, big emotional outbursts or expressions of emotion. And she said she just shut down. She waited for him to ride the storm, shut down, and then came back to him later on. So she wasn't able to help him through these strong emotional feelings. He was left alone to do that. I guess the thing about unresolved trauma is that you continue to experience the past trauma as if it were in the present. You see everything in the present through the lens of the past in relation to that particular trauma. And certainly this is what happened to Lillian. She perceived her children and her relationship with her children through the lens of her past unresolved loss of her brother in particular. But from the very beginning, before she even had her children, she was preoccupied with the notion that they would die. And she said to me, I always thought if I have a child, I have to be prepared to lose that child. Because her brother was a male, she did not want to have boys. And she said that she really prayed that she wouldn't have boys, and having boys was not the plan. There were specific links between her brother, who had passed, and David. And this frightened her. So there was already an emotional fear associated with David by virtue of the fact that he reminded her of her brother in some very physical ways and some personality ways. And because she didn't have an understanding of her brother's suicide, then she had a very generalized anxiety in relation to death and losing her children. So, for example, rather than attributing his suicide to what was probably most likely to have contributed to it, which was the family situation growing up, she attributed to the fact, for example, that there was a storm on the morning that he killed himself, and that may have affected his neurology, and that he had a conversation with a girl next door beforehand, and that may have triggered this desire to kill himself. So it just meant that she was generally anxious in relation to her boys because she hadn't actually fully understood the reasons for him taking his life or for his death. And so all of this together meant that this ongoing fear of death in relation to her boys, it just reinforced her own survival need for emotional distance from them. So she kept her boys, including David, at quite a distance from her. And the third big issue was that she had, in order to survive as a child growing, she had to take on somehow the blame for her mother's violence, because, if she had attributed the adequate or the appropriate responsibility to her mother, it would have been very difficult for her to stay close to her mother. And this is the thing about attachment, that a child has to adapt in some way so that they can protect themselves from the danger, but also stay close enough to mom to be protected, and to have their needs met in some way. So she had to distort the reality, and she came to believe that she was to blame for her mother's violence and neglect. And she also came to believe, it transpired, that was responsible for her brother's suicide, that she felt that she'd put ideas of suicide into his head because of a conversation they'd had perhaps a year before he killed himself. And so she had this unconscious belief that, like her mother, she too was a source of harm to her boys, and therefore she needed to protect them from her by keeping them at an emotional distance. So her intention was to protect her children, and this was the best way that she could do it. So she was well intended. And an example of this is that she feared telling them that she even had a brother. She never told them she had a brother. She said, the boys don't know about my brother. They don't know I even had a brother. And I don't want to tell them because I don't want to put ideas in their heads. So such was her fear that she would somehow damage her children herself. So in terms of the progress that she made, it was significant. And I've actually decided to use her own words to describe the progress that she's made in those areas that we identified together. Over the course of the work, she came to realize that her greatest challenge as a parent is to remain emotionally open to her boys and their big emotions. And she became more confident in this, and she conveyed this through a conversation she had with a friend of hers once, where she was explaining the work she had done. And she said to me, I was talking to a friend of mine and she's had a challenging upbringing herself. So I did explain about needing to be emotionally open. And she said, but you've always done so much for your kids, bringing them to this professional and that person. And I said, yes, but it's about me being emotionally available. It isn't just about going to everybody else to get the help. I mean, that's the thing. You can be involved as a parent doing. But I mean, my own mother tried to help me with things along the way, but it didn't include being emotionally available. And so what was very heartening about that is that she came to recognize not only what she needed to do with her own child, but she also came to recognize that's not what she got, which was really helpful in terms of her own work and her own recognition of what she had been through and developing some sort of compassion towards herself. In particular, she redefined that word clingy that she had used to describe what really was normal needs of a child, needs of an emotional child. And she said, through the work, I got insight into what was affecting my relationship with my kids. And, ideas that I had about being a child and this thing about being clingy, that it's okay. And like even this week, it's been really helpful because Mark, that's her youngest, is really feeling the struggle of being without his classmates. And he said, Mommy, I think I'm scared of lots of things. And because of this work, I was able to say, Mark, it's okay to be scared at 9. I was really scared when I was 9. That's what we're here for. And I said stuff that wouldn't have come to me until I read your report, and I read it just in time. It's okay to feel you need Daddy and me around. That's why we're here, to protect you in all of that. And all the stuff that didn't happen for me. So that's been huge. So again, she's able to link her past experience with her current relationship with her children. In terms of her unresolved loss of her brother and the trauma, she began to better understand the link between the traumatic loss of her brother and David. And she began to identify how David was similar to her brother. He had the same color skin and they had an aptitude for maths. And it's very interesting that she had realized that she was discouraging his aptitude for maths because she didn't want him to be like her brother, because she was afraid he too would kill himself. An irrational fear, but very understandable fear. And it helped her to realize that she was doing to her son what was done to her, that she had not been able to see him in his own right, and that she was projecting onto him her fears about her brother. And she had felt that way as a twin. And so she had written a letter to management to to advocate for other parents to get this work. But in it, she mentioned this, and she says, by taking the time to slowly uncover my own fears and defense strategies, she, that's me, has helped me to see my habit of interpreting my relationship with my son through a lens blurred by events that have nothing to do with him. Because of this work, I now feel empowered to see my son as he is, a beautiful little boy, which is absolutely lovely. And finally, I mean, I wasn't really sure whether she would be able to make the further link then between her past, her experience of being parented, her experience of parenting, and the impact it was having on David's restricted feeding. But she really was, and it was really impressive and very heartening to see it. She said at the end of the work, I've always thought that David has been looking for something more than I can give him. And, you know, the concrete interpretation of that would be that I can't feed him the way he wants to be fed, or that he doesn't feel safe with what I'm offering him. But obviously, I'm more aware now about his emotional attachment. And if I'm more emotionally available to him through this, then he will let down that guard and be more expressive with me, and hopefully then with the food, and he'll take those chances. I have to make him feel emotionally safe in other ways first, and then see, because clearly, Ruth, we saw that he can eat the food. He ate it here with you, which he did over the course of the work that he did. And she was able to see that he was willing to try new tastes and new textures. But he wasn't able to transfer it home because Lillian herself didn't feel confident and she wasn't available to him in order to support him to do that. But it was so heartening to see that actually she felt that she was. And she finished by saying, without this work, I would not have progressed with feeding my son. They had been to an awful lot of different interventions along the way over the years. So I guess my point is this, that sometimes children's needs would be best met by meeting their parents' personal needs, because children rarely live better than their parents. So parents' suffering affects their children. And I think my experience of the services is that we don't, we think that's a sort of an added extra, or something, a luxury that we can't afford. But actually, you know, my own perspective is actually it's the other way around. At times we really need to prioritize the parents, because inevitably, you know, that would affect their parenting of the child. And I really love John Bowlby's sentiment that if a community values its children, it must cherish their parents. So I have no idea how long I've spent talking, probably longer than I should, but that's the presentation. I'll stop sharing if I can do that and come back.
Well, thank you, Ruth. That's great. That was really lots and lots of food for thought. So I don't know if anyone's got any questions they want to ask. Well, we have Ruth here. Any thoughts? Gayla?
Thank you, Ruth. That was really wonderful. I wonder if I'm just thinking about the difference between mother and father in attachment, and I'm thinking about families where there is only one parent, and whether that attachment is also difficult and more difficult and also different than where there's two parents parenting.
I think unfortunately it is. And the theory would tell us that, and the research would tell us that. In the very early stages, the role of the father is a protective one, to allow that very intense, intimate relationship between the mother and the child to blossom, to develop. And that's a key piece. He allows his presence there allows mom and baby to be in that phase that they call primary maternal preoccupation, where the mother can give herself over to the child in the way that she needs in order to learn the cues of her, you know, the unique cues of her child, her newborn child. And we do know subsequently then, obviously then children, you know, when the child moves out of that phase and their world opens up, dad becomes extremely important in other ways and develop a separate attachment. And we just know that the benefit of having two parents is that the child experiences two different types of attachment. So as they grow then through life, they have, let's say, a greater range or a greater opportunity for flexible strategies and behaviors. So it does benefit the child to have that wider range of experiences with two parents. That's not to say that, you know, the child who doesn't have the father won't develop. I mean, all children then face other challenges of developing new attachment relationships, for example, in school. So a child may have had a particular attachment style to mom and dad, but they find themselves in school with a teacher who's very different, and they have to adapt, and that's part of the resilience. But the body of evidence would unfortunately suggest that it is more challenging. Having said, there's one sort of caveat to that. We do know that if mom's approach is extremely different to dad's approach, that actually can be overly challenging for the child. So it isn't an automatic fact that two parents will automatically be better for the child, but mostly that would be the case. I think, yeah, it is more challenging for a single parent.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, or people, if they're happier to type it in the chat? I think there's huge amounts to think about, isn't there? And particularly myself as a physiotherapist, I'm thinking about how that can affect me in my practice, and what can I do differently? How do I need to perhaps think differently to not have your skills to go in the depth that you've done, but still help and support the parents and support that relationship?
I mean, I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is, and I did make the point, I guess it's just to be aware that the treatment and therapeutic plans, when there are many of them, you know, when the child has complex needs and they are attending speech and language and physio and OT, that the treatment plans can feel like they get in the way at times, you know. And sometimes the work in psychology is about just reminding the parents that first and foremost, their presence with the child in an attentive, calm, regulated way is hugely important. And I think I guess the onus is on us to communicate that, because I think there's a frantic demand and urgency to access all the different range of professions, and then they each have their treatment plan. And I think some sort of coordinated approach, you know, certainly as a multidisciplinary team or service, is obviously optimum, where we can.
Yeah, I think potentially.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, it's really overwhelming, isn't it? If you've got
Yeah.
the physio plan, you've got the OT plan, you've got the speech therapist plan. It's, you know, it needs to be a family plan, which we all kind of bring our expertise to contribute to, and have kind of priorities of the time, and remembering that, you know, they're parents first, aren't they? Not trying to turn people into therapists.
Yeah.
When it's a lot to parent in some of those situations.
Yeah. And I think it's challenging because the model at the moment is heading in the direction of sort of co-therapy, like a parent as co-therapist. And, you know, obviously resources are limited and we can only see parents for so long. And so we want to empower them and skill them up to be able to do what they need to do. But I think it's a delicate balance, I think, between those tasks and just being with your child and not feeling like everything's a teaching moment. And you can see that if you do, I would do quite a bit of video work with parents where they are required to play with your child in a very structured way, and we look at it together. And very often one of the challenges is that everything they do with their child, including nurturing experiences, becomes teaching. And so they miss out on those little cues that the child gives them, where they just turn to mom and they just want to look at mom's face, or see mom, or feel mom, or touch mom. That those cues are lost. So it can be very powerful to do that work, you know, which is really. But yes, as a team, I guess, as a service, we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah, and time to just enjoy your child and enjoy the company of your child rather than always feeling you've got to be doing something with a purpose.
Mm.
Because all those other things that you do that don't have a purpose also have a purpose, don't
Have
they?
a
And they're
purpose.
really important. You know, it's like we don't think about it, but it's got that value, and you've got to be careful, you know, as therapists, not to put too much of a burden on families so that they don't have time for those parts of things. And yeah, trying to get therapy that fits in with daily life rather than therapy that's to the side, so you've got to stop daily life. I think that's an important thing for us to all think about. How can I get something that's helpful for the child that integrates into what they want to do and how they're interacting?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Anyone else got any thoughts or anything they'd like to ask? It seems really valuable having Ruth here, because we don't have enough of, well, certainly in our service, enough psychology intervention. It's often well, in the UK, a gap that's missing in teams.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
We now have half a day a week of a psychologist, and that's been really great for us. But it's not very much.
No, it's limited. It's limited. And I guess that's just, you know, I was thinking about it myself in terms of, I think even within psychology at times, you know, there's such demand for cognitive assessments and, you know, ASD assessments and school reports and all that sort of stuff, and behavioral intervention, that even within psychology, I think it's often an area that's not explored enough because it's time consuming. This work is time consuming. So I guess how we have managed that in terms of our pathways is that we do this work, which is a larger investment. We do it with families that tend to be a little more stuck. So a little bit like Lillian, like she had been to multiple services, had done all the courses, had done the courses that we provided, the parents group on feeding, had done the actual feeding intervention with me over several months, which a lot of parents don't get. But David was deemed to be medically, you know, in need. And still it didn't shift. Still it didn't shift. And it required this work to shift in some way. And actually I didn't mention in the presentation, but I have followed up with Lillian, and David is eating his 2 new foods, which is very big, and like that's quite significant. But she said more generally, her focus was more on his adaptability. She said as a little boy, she has noticed in the last number of months that he's more adaptive to situations, that he's more comfortable with her not being physically around when he goes to parties and things like that, and better able to deal with disappointment. So at the end of our work, he thought he was coming back to do more work with me, and he discovered that he wasn't. It's just a very small example, but she said she just found that he coped with that better, that normally that would trigger a difficult experience for him, and she just felt that had improved. So I think if that is the foundation now for him, you know, as a result of mom being more emotionally available to him and more attuned to him and more responsive to him, that's a wonderful basis to take forward, regardless of the foods. You know, the foods will take care of themselves slowly over time, but he now seems to have something a little bit more substantial in his core in relation to her and their relationship. And I think it's very hard to measure. It'd be very, very hard to measure that, you know.
It's huge, isn't
But
it? It's huge.
yeah, it's substantial. Yeah.
And it's back to that, really working out what the core of the issue is, isn't it? What's the challenge? What's making that happen? And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about parent-child relationship for the babies and as part of our early intervention program. But it's interesting, you know, this is something that's now impacting a much older child, and is still sort of 10 years old.
Yes, I mean, and obviously the earlier the intervention, the better, but we don't always, in fact, we don't tend to get those referrals in psychology, because I think there's so much else going on that you know, and in our service, in specialist services here, there's myself and I only have one senior psychologist at the moment. So we cover about 7 different clinics. So it's just not possible to be available. But I think I've done a lot of training and education this year, and I think that's the way we need to go, which is educating the teams about the importance of this, and you know, as a way of using limited resources. So that's part of our plan for.
Yeah, it's yeah, resources. It's a shame when that's the limiting factor always, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've got 10 minutes left. If anyone else has got a question, a comment, a thought. Gayla's unmuted. I'm thinking she might have a query.
Something coming.
Sorry, I've got another question. I'm just wondering about families often talk about for therapists when we're so involved with the families that we're like part of family. And I'm just wondering about that sort of attachment, whether that's a healthy attachment or whether it's not. And I know that really varies across different countries, but there are some families where therapists are involved, and often during really difficult times, like for example, if a child's preterm, is really unwell, is hospitalized for period, you know, those sorts of really life-changing experiences. And I'm wondering about those sorts of types of attachment. And also because a lot of the times the families have lots of different therapists, you know, therapists change quite a lot. And I'm wondering how that, you know, thinking about service delivery, how that works for
Yes.
families, and that can be quite disruptive as well. Sometimes you stay with a family, you know, for their whole, you know, 0 to 16 years. And then sometimes some children might have 10 therapy, you know, 10 physios, 10 OTs, 5 speech language, you know, like a lot of people within their time. Could you just sort of talk about that?
Yeah, that's I'm really glad you did, because I had a few slides I was going to share on that, but so it's absolutely key. The relationship with the therapist, if it's good, is extremely positive. Just even using this example with Lillian, it's theoretically advised, and in experience, in practice, it's what I experienced. And I think this was part of what helped Lillian, is that I, as therapist, became this what we call an auxiliary attachment figure. So I became, for her, the safe, predictable, consistent, attentive, warm presence that gave her the experience of something that she lacked in her childhood. And it was really only through our therapeutic relationship and her having an experience of being attuned to and cared for and validated and supported that she was able then to provide that for David. So actually it's essential. It's the mechanism or the gateway through which the parent then shifts their experience. And it can be painful, because in receiving the thing that you lacked, you realize the lack, and you have to experience the lack, and you feel the lack. And for a woman who was very self-reliant and very blocked off, she did over time, you know, open and engage and feel her feelings of loss. So it's not only preferable, it's actually essential for this type of work. And I know it's different with the wider team. I know that, you know, a physio and an OT and an SLT is not going to, you know, have that level of intense connection. However, you know, some might, and if they are in a position to get to know the family over a long period of time, if they can be that consistent presence in the family, they will have the same impact. So, I mean, if you have the luxury of that, then that's absolutely wonderful. I guess the other scenario is where what you mentioned, Gayla, which is multiple therapists sort of all coming at the family at the one time. But I guess if you have a multidisciplinary approach and you can discuss as a team, you know, what's prioritized over what. And if you have a key worker, one of those therapists is a key worker for the family, then that's a great idea. But I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the therapist is a potential auxiliary attachment figure that can actually give the parents, give the families the type of support and emotional regulation that they maybe didn't get before, or maybe did get before, but now they're in the eye of the storm with a child who has a disability, and they need someone to come help regulate them so that they can be regulated emotionally for their child. So any therapist who can have that kind of calming, regulating effect on the family is worth their weight in gold. So I'm really glad you mentioned it. It's a key issue.
Oh, thank you. That's really interesting thinking about it this way, because you can worry about the level of involvement and how, yeah, where exactly that should be. And families do get quite attached to different therapists at different times. Yeah. Now I feel that's, yeah, being that positive, regulating, it's different ways of looking at it. That's really good, really helpful. Thank you. Gaila, did you want to add anything to that or comment?
No, I'm just I suppose I'm thinking about we've been discussing the attachment from the parent's perspective, which this is about, but I'm just sort of reflecting on what you've said and thinking about when attachment isn't healthy between people. So, you know, where attachment isn't healthy between a family and say a health professional, you know, it's maybe overburdening, or people aren't able to cope with that sort of level of response. You know, it's quite a responsibility, isn't it? You know, I'm thinking about, or you don't feel like you have that training, or, you know, you're worried about what you're going to say or do. I think, can it be a negative, you know, can you make things worse, I suppose?
I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can, particularly if you don't. I mean, let's take the premise that every professional goes into a relationship with a family with the best of intentions, but I guess in an effort to be very helpful at times, perhaps staff can be overzealous or not. I guess one of the things that we have done here in the CRC is to educate staff from a trauma-informed perspective, so that they can see the struggles that the families are experiencing when they come traumatized from their experiences, that in fact they're not sufficiently regulated, they're not in that window of tolerance where they can actually take in information. And if staff don't know that, and they're trying their very hardest to communicate and to give them information and to support them, and the family still can't take it in, and then there's a breakdown, because, you know, the therapist is like, well, I've tried everything I possibly can, and they're just not cooperative, or they're difficult, or they're not, you know, they're not doing what they need to do, and I need them to do what they need to do. So yes, that can be very problematic. And I think if a family has enough of those experiences, then we have an uphill struggle to try and re-engage them. So I guess that's been the philosophy or the rationale behind our trauma-informed education, that actually, that, you know, if you have a family coming in for the first time, you need to pay attention to this, and you need to expect that they will find it very difficult to take in. So maybe you need to spend, if you have the luxury of the session getting to know the family, or maybe you need to write things down because they won't remember it. Or maybe they need a follow-up call because they may not have taken in half of what you thought you told them. Or, you know, so whatever the different strategies are that we can use to support families in a time of crisis and in a state of dysregulation. So that, you know, and that's quite helpful. I mean, staff have found those very helpful, because it's not maybe the first thing that they think of when they meet a new family is their regulation, or their trauma, or their past maybe negative experiences with services. And there is a lack of trust at times, and parents at the moment are very dissatisfied with the services that they're getting in the disability sector. And so when they come to us and they've had to wait for a long time, they really are quite, you know, some are acting, you know, from that sense of mistrust and anger and resentment, that you've left me to cope with this by myself for so long. So you're not, you know, you're not always playing on a level playing field. Sometimes you're experiencing predetermined, you know, negative feelings, and also, you know, a lot of the families that we would work with have had quite traumatic, you know, experiences in the hospital, and that has carried on. Anybody associated professionally with that, you know, are not to be trusted. So yeah, it's sort of like the foundation, or the unspoken piece of the puzzle. Like I think of it as sort of like the heating system that you just don't think about until it breaks down. You know, that whole attachment relationship between the parent and the child, the family and the services, it's running in the background all the time. And if we don't pay attention to it, it can really be an obstacle to the work. Despite how good you are as a therapist and how well-intentioned you are.
Yeah, I think that's so right. And I think it's something, takes a lot of experience to see that bit, because, you know, we all want to deliver what we've got to deliver, but actually if that bit's not right, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to be able to make progress. I'm just very aware of the time.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Ruth. That was a really thought-provoking session. I'm really pleased that we've recorded it, because I think I personally will watch it again when it's up on the website, because lots of things to think about there. And I think that's really helpful for lots of us. So thank you. Huge thank you for doing that.
Thank you all. And thanks, Jenny, for your support in getting me up and running.
Oh, pleasure. That's what we're here for.
Thanks. And thanks to Gaila for organising. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.